The Apache Hearttaker, Tombstone's Noon Curse, before the OK Corral, Arizona, 1881. The sun hung low over Tombstone, Arizona, casting long shadows that stretched across the rough desert town. The streets, often filled with dust and grit, were quieter than usual this morning. There was a heavy silence in the air, one that seemed to wrap itself around the town, making everyone uneasy. The people of Tombstone had heard whispers of an Apache warrior, one known only as Takshihi, or Hearttaker. He was a man feared by many and respected by few. Takashi was not just a warrior. He was a symbol of the power of the Apache people, someone who could take the life of his enemy with a single blow. But it wasn't just his skill with a knife or his deadly aim that made him feared. It was his reputation, a reputation that grew every time he was called upon to fight. As the town began to stir, the rumors grew louder. The settlers spoke in hushed voices about a raid that had taken place at a nearby ranch. There was talk that Takashi had led the attack, and in his wake death had followed. But the truth was much darker than what the settlers could imagine. Takashi had not attacked the ranch. His people had not been responsible. In truth, it had been a group of rival Apache warriors who had raided the ranch, hoping to incite further violence between the settlers and the Apache tribes. But Takashi's name had been used to fuel the fire. His reputation had been dragged through the dirt. The settlers, scared and desperate for justice, blamed him for the bloodshed. They didn't care that Takashi had nothing to do with the raid. His name alone was enough to make him a target. The Apache warrior, meanwhile, knew what had been done. He knew that the violence against his people would only escalate because of the lies. His people would suffer for the actions of others, and he could not stand by and let that happen. So Takashi did what any man would do in his position. He went into hiding. He disappeared into the desert, leaving behind the town that had once feared him but now hated him. But there was more to Takashi's actions than just survival. As he sat alone in the desert, his mind went to the words of an elder spoken many years before. The curse of the Hearttaker will fall upon those who seek to destroy what is sacred. Until justice is done, the land will suffer. Tombstone will never know peace. The elder's words echoed in his mind as he thought of the curse that had been foretold, a curse that would follow the town until the wrongs were righted. Takashi understood what the elder had meant now. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. If the people of Tombstone didn't make things right, if they didn't understand the truth, then they would all face the consequences. The curse would not be lifted until the heart of the matter was addressed. The warrior's mind raced as he realized what he needed to do. He could not allow the town to continue in this way, but he also knew that any move he made could lead to more bloodshed. He would have to find another way. Takashi wasn't just a man of violence. He was also a man of honor. The question was, how could he restore his honor and clear his name without causing more harm? The townspeople, meanwhile, were growing restless. The settlers gathered at the local saloon, speaking in angry tones. They were fearful, but also angry. They wanted justice, and they wanted it now. The lawmen, including the Earp brothers, had already started to prepare for a confrontation. Word had spread quickly that Takashi was hiding in the desert, and the lawmen were determined to find him. Wyatt Earp, the man known for upholding justice, had promised to bring the Apache warrior to justice for the raid on the ranch. But what they didn't know was that they were chasing the wrong man. Takashi had always been a ghost in the desert, a shadow that no one could catch. He moved swiftly through the harsh landscape, disappearing and reappearing without a trace. He had trained for years, learning the ways of the land and how to survive in a place that would kill any man who wasn't prepared, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving his innocence. This was about showing the world that he wasn't the monster they believed him to be. As Takashi sat near the cliffs that overlooked Tombstone, he saw the town below, a small collection of buildings surrounded by the barren land. The wind howled in the distance, and for a moment he thought he could hear the voices of those who had died in the raid, voices that had been silenced because of a lie. Takashi clenched his fists. The curse had begun, but it wasn't just his people who would suffer. The town of Tombstone would feel the weight of the curse too. If the truth wasn't revealed, if the town didn't understand the role it had played in this injustice, then it would fall into ruin. The curse would not leave until everything had been paid for. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He had to find a way to make the people of Tombstone see the truth. He couldn't just fight. He had to convince them. But how? Takashi wasn't a man of words. He was a man of action. Yet he knew that the time had come to use his skills in a different way. In the heart of Tombstone, the clock continued to tick. The people waited, not knowing that the fate of their town was in the hands of a man they had wrongfully blamed. The Earp brothers were preparing for the inevitable confrontation, but what they didn't realize was that the true battle wasn't with Takashi. It was with the darkness that had been unleashed in the town by lies and hatred. The warrior's fate would soon be decided, and with it, the fate of Tombstone itself. Takashi stood up and began to walk toward the town, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He knew that the curse had only begun, and only by facing the truth would it be broken. As the sun set over the desert, the shadows grew longer, and the curse of the Heart-Taker began to close in on the town that had once called him an enemy. A week had passed since the rumors about the Apache Heart-Taker, Takashi, had begun to stir in Tombstone. The town, known for its wild ways and lawless atmosphere, had grown more tense. The streets, usually bustling with miners, gamblers, and cattlemen, now seemed quieter. The sun still beat down on the dusty streets, but something had changed in the air. There was a sense of dread hanging over the town, as if everyone knew something big was coming, something that would change the course of their lives forever. People were nervous. They didn't know what would happen next, but they could feel that something was going to happen. The settlers and townsfolk gathered in small groups at the local saloon, speaking in hushed voices about the Apache warrior Takashi. Some said he was coming to take revenge for the raid on the ranch. Others whispered that the curse was already taking hold, that Tombstone was destined for destruction unless something was done to stop it. But few truly understood the power of the curse, or that it wasn't just an old tale told to scare the children. It was real. The lawmen, led by Wyatt Earp, had already begun their search for Takeshi. They had placed a bounty on his head, hoping to bring him to justice for the attack on the ranch. Wyatt and his brothers, Virgil Morgan and their friend Doc Holliday, were determined to find the Apache warrior. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, the tension in the town would boil over. But what they didn't know was that Takashi was already watching them from afar, a shadow in the desert. Takashi had heard of the bounty. He knew that the lawmen were searching for him, but he also knew that his name had been dragged through the dirt. He had never been involved in the raid on the ranch, and he couldn't understand why his people had been blamed for it, but he had learned long ago that justice was often not about what was right, but what was believed. And in this case, the people of Tombstone believed he was guilty. As the days passed, Takashi moved deeper into the desert, staying hidden from the lawmen. He had learned the land better than any settler or lawman could. He knew how to survive, how to disappear when needed, but this time survival wasn't enough. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from the curse that had been placed on Tombstone. He understood now that the only way to end it was to find a way to make the truth known. If he didn't, the town would continue to suffer, and it might not survive what was coming. The town, meanwhile, had grown more uneasy. Word of Takashi's disappearance spread like wildfire. People were scared, and they didn't know where to turn. There were stories of strange sightings in the desert, of shadows moving in the distance, and of cattle found dead without any sign of what had killed them. Some said it was Takashi, others said it was the curse beginning to take hold. No one could agree on what was happening, but everyone could feel it. The town was on edge, and it seemed like something terrible was about to happen. Wyatt Earp knew he couldn't let the fear and uncertainty last forever. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know when something was brewing. The law had to be upheld, and if Takashi was guilty, then Wyatt would be the one to bring him to justice. But as much as he believed in the law, he also understood that there were things beyond their control. The curse that had been spoken over Tombstone couldn't be ignored. He had heard the whispers, just like everyone else. He knew that if he wasn't careful, he might be leading the town into something far worse than just a fight with an Apache warrior. As Wyatt and his brothers prepared to leave town, heading into the desert to track down Takashi, they spoke little. Each of them knew that the situation was dangerous. Doc Holliday, always calm under pressure, had his own concerns. He wasn't just worried about Takashi. He was worried about the curse and how it might be affecting the town. He had seen death in many forms, but the fear in the people's eyes was something different. It wasn't just the fear of an outlaw or a raid. It was the fear of something more, something that no one could control. As the Earp brothers rode out of Tombstone, they didn't realize that Takashi was only a few miles away, watching them from a rocky outcrop. He had been tracking them for days, but he wasn't just watching the lawmen. He was watching the town. He knew that if they found him, it would only make the curse stronger. The curse would be complete. But if he could stay hidden long enough, if he could find a way to make the truth known, then perhaps he could stop it before it was too late. Meanwhile, back in the town, the people were growing restless. The saloon was filled with whispers, and the streets seemed emptier than ever. The townspeople didn't know who to trust anymore. The settlers were fearful of the Apache and the curse, while others wondered if the lawmen would be able to bring peace. There was talk of leaving town, of packing up and heading to safer places, but most of them were stuck. Tombstone was their home, and no matter how much fear gripped their hearts, they couldn't leave. This was where they had built their lives, and they weren't ready to abandon it yet. But as the days dragged on, the curse seemed to tighten its grip on the town. Strange things began happening. People disappeared, and no one could explain why. There were sightings of Takashi, but each time someone tried to track him down, he vanished. The lawmen became frustrated, but their frustration only added to the tension. It was as if the whole town was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment when the curse would reveal its true power. Takashi, hidden in the desert, could feel the curse tightening around the town. He knew it wouldn't be long before the lawmen found him. But he also knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Tombstone suffer any longer. He had to find a way to stop the violence, to stop the fear, and to prove that he was not the enemy. But how? Takashi knew that the answer lay within the town itself. The people had to be shown the truth. He could only hope that they would listen before it was too late. The sun hung heavily over the desert, casting long shadows across the town of Tombstone. The once bustling streets were now empty, save for the few souls who still went about their business, heads down, eyes avoiding the dark corners where fear seemed to linger. It was no secret that Tombstone had been gripped by the curse that had been spoken of since Takashi, the Apache warrior known as the Heart Taker, had been falsely accused of a crime he did not commit. The tension in the town was palpable, and it seemed like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the storm to break. Takashi, meanwhile, had been in the desert for days, reflecting on the situation and the path he needed to take. As skilled a warrior as he was, he understood that this was not a battle he could win with his knife or rifle. It wasn't a fight he could win with violence or strength alone. He had to find another way, a way to break the curse without causing more suffering. The people of Tombstone had already suffered enough. They didn't deserve to live in fear, caught between the lawmen who were chasing him and the curse that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Takashi had spent much of his life learning how to survive in the harshest of environments. The desert had taught him patience, taught him how to move without being seen, how to track his prey and stay hidden. But now, the desert was not just a place of survival, it was a place of reflection. Takashi couldn't ignore the weight of the curse, nor could he ignore the truth that had been twisted. The Apache had not been responsible for the raid on the ranch. His people had been wronged by a rival group, but the settlers didn't know that. They only knew what they had been told, and in their fear they had chosen to believe the worst. But Takashi could see that there was more to this than just clearing his name. The curse that had been placed on Tombstone was not just about his reputation. It was about the violence and hatred that had been allowed to fester. The people of Tombstone had been living in a state of fear for too long. They had been at odds with the Apache for years, and the truth was that no one was innocent in this conflict. There were those who had taken advantage of the distrust between the settlers and the native tribes, fueling the hatred and suspicion that had led to this point. Takashi knew that the only way to end this cycle of violence was to find a way to unite the people of Tombstone, to show them that they could live in peace, if only they were willing to trust each other. But how could he do that when they had already labeled him an enemy? He had no choice but to go to the one person who might understand, the one person who might be able to listen to him and help him make sense of everything. Josie Marcus, a woman he had once loved before the war and violence had torn their lives apart. Josie had been living in Tombstone for years, running a small store on the edge of town. She was a woman of strength who had seen firsthand the damage the conflict had caused. She had seen the settlers' fear, their anger, and their desperation, but she had also seen the other side, the side that was not spoken of, the side that showed the humanity of the Apache people. Josie knew that not all of them were the savages that the settlers believed them to be. She had learned that lesson when she had first met Takashi all those years ago. The last time they had spoken, things had been different. The world had been different. Josie had been young, and Takashi had been a man of honor, a warrior of the Apache, but that had been before the raids, before the lies that had torn apart their lives. Josie had heard the stories of the Apache Heart Taker, and like everyone else, she had come to believe the worst of him. But now, with the curse hanging over the town and the truth becoming more elusive with each passing day, Josie had begun to question everything. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her heart that something didn't add up. Takashi had to find her. He had to make her understand that the curse was not a punishment for something he had done, but a punishment for the hatred and mistrust that had been allowed to build over time. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Josie might never forgive him for the way things had ended between them, but he had no other choice. He had to find a way to make her believe that the only way out of this mess was to face the truth. In the early morning hours, Takashi made his way toward Tombstone, moving quietly and carefully. He knew the lawmen would be looking for him, but he also knew that he had to reach Josie before it was too late. As he approached the town, he saw the familiar buildings, the saloon, and the store where Josie worked. It had been so long since he had seen her, but he could still remember the way she looked at him, the way her eyes had once filled with love and understanding. It had been a different time, a time when they had both hoped for a future together. But that was before the world had changed, before the war had taken everything from them. Takashi approached the back door of Josie's store and knocked gently. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. The door creaked open, and there she stood, Josie Marcus, the woman who had once meant everything to him. But now her face was hard, wary, and filled with the pain of years spent living in fear. "Takashi," she said softly, her voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" He could see the fear in her eyes, but he could also see the uncertainty. She didn't know whether to trust him or to fear him. He had to make her understand. "Josie, I didn't do it," he said, his voice steady. "The raid on the ranch wasn't me. It wasn't my people. I'm not the one you should fear." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read him, to see if his words were true. She wanted to believe him, but the fear that had been planted in her heart over the years was hard to shake. "You expect me to believe that?" she asked quietly. "After everything that's happened? After everything we've been through?" Takashi nodded. "I understand your fear. But the truth is more complicated than the stories they've told you. The people who did this, they used my name to hide their own crimes. They wanted to destroy us, both you and me, but I will not let them. I will not let the curse claim this town." Josie hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She still wasn't sure if she believed him, but something in her heart told her that he was telling the truth. The curse, the fear, it all made sense now. It wasn't just about Takashi. It was about the anger and hatred that had been building for years, and now it was time to face it. The tension in Tombstone was reaching a breaking point. The sun hung high in the sky, and the air was dry and still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Every person in Tombstone could feel it. The curse was growing stronger. Every day, strange things happened. Livestock disappeared overnight, strange tracks were found near the outskirts of town, and the wind seemed to carry whispers of doom. The townspeople were growing increasingly anxious, their nerves stretched thin. Some had already packed their bags, ready to leave the moment the lawman had dealt with Takashi. But others, the ones who had lived through so much hardship, chose to stay. They were unwilling to let the curse take their home, their lives, and their future. Takashi had spent the past few days working silently in the shadows. Though the lawmen still scoured the desert in search of him, he had found a way to stay hidden. His knowledge of the land, of the desert, kept him one step ahead. He knew that the lawmen were close, but he also knew that they were not his true enemy. The real enemy was the curse that had been spoken when the truth had been buried under fear and anger. Takashi had realized that he could not break this curse alone. The curse wasn't just about him, it was about the town's deep-seated fear, the hatred that had been allowed to grow for so long. But one thing had become clear to him. He could no longer stay hidden forever. He had to confront the town, confront the people who had condemned him without knowing the truth. They needed to hear it from him directly. The curse could only be broken if the truth was laid bare, if the people of Tombstone could understand the damage they had done by believing lies. But how could he convince them? How could he make them see that he was not their enemy? Takashi knew he couldn't do it alone, and that's why he had sought out Josie. Josie Marcus was the only person in Tombstone who might understand, who might be willing to help him. She was a woman of courage, someone who had seen both sides of the conflict between settlers and the Apache. But even Josie was torn. She wanted to believe in Takashi, but the stories, the hatred, the fear that had been planted in her heart over the years couldn't be easily forgotten. She needed more than just words. She needed proof, and Takashi knew that. As the sun began to set, Takashi and Josie sat on the porch of her small home, the desert stretching out before them. The silence between them felt heavy, but Josie finally spoke. "How do you expect them to believe you, Takashi?" she asked softly. "The damage has already been done. The lawmen are already searching for you, and they won't stop until they find you." Takashi's gaze was steady as he looked at her. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't let this town suffer because of lies. The curse will destroy this place if we don't do something. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone here. If they don't understand what has happened, if they don't know the truth, the curse will continue to grow, and it will take them all." Josie was silent for a moment, her eyes reflecting the setting sun. She had seen the fear in the people's eyes, felt it in her own heart. The curse was real, and it was growing stronger every day. But could they really break it? Could the people of Tombstone ever accept the truth? "What are you asking me to do?" Josie asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm asking you to help me show them the truth," Takashi said. "I need you to speak to them, to make them listen. You're the only one who can." Josie took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't want to believe that she was the only one who could help, but a part of her knew that Takashi was right. He couldn't face the town alone. And despite everything, despite the years of mistrust, Josie still saw something in him that made her believe he was telling the truth. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, there was no fear in him, only a quiet resolve. Josie wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew that if there was any hope of breaking the curse, she had to try. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help you. But it won't be easy. There are too many people here who have already made up their minds about you. They won't listen." Takashi nodded. "I know. But we have to try. We can't let this go on any longer." The next day, Josie went into town. She knew the risk she was taking, but it was the only chance she had to stop the curse from consuming Tombstone. As she walked through the streets, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her. Some of them whispered as she passed, others turned their heads quickly, afraid to look at her. They all knew she was going to speak to the people about Takashi, but what they didn't know was that she wasn't just going to speak about him. She was going to speak the truth. The saloon was crowded, as it often was at this time of day. The smell of smoke and whiskey filled the air as Josie entered. She could see the Earp brothers sitting at one of the tables, their eyes following her as she made her way to the center of the room. The lawmen knew why she was here, and their eyes were filled with suspicion. But Josie didn't falter. She knew what she had to do. The room fell quiet as Josie stood before them, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been one for speeches, never had the courage to stand in front of a room full of people and speak her mind. But today was different. Today the truth had to be heard. "I know that many of you are afraid," Josie began, her voice steady but firm. "I know that you've heard the stories, that you've been told that Takashi is the one responsible for the raid on the ranch, but I'm here to tell you that you've been lied to. Takashi did not attack that ranch. It was not his people who were responsible." The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the room. Josie held up a hand to silence them. "I know it's hard to believe," she continued, "but Takashi has been wronged. He has been blamed for something he did not do. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we don't admit the truth, this curse will never end." Wyatt Earp stood up from his seat, his face hard. "You expect us to believe that? After everything that's happened?" Josie met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," she said, "but I ask you to listen. Silence, the fear, it's all because we refuse to see the truth. If we keep living in hatred, we will destroy ourselves. The curse will continue until we choose to end it." There was a long silence in the room. The lawmen exchanged glances, and the townsfolk shifted uneasily. Josie didn't know if her words would be enough, but she knew that it was the only chance they had. She could only hope that the truth would set them free. The town of Tombstone was no longer just a place where people lived. It had become a battleground of sorts, one where fear and distrust ran deep, and every corner seemed to whisper of doom. The curse that had been placed upon the town continued to grow, spreading unease like wildfire. People had begun to notice the changes. Their cattle were found dead without explanation. The desert winds carried strange sounds, and shadows seemed to lurk just out of sight. For those who lived in Tombstone, it was clear that something had to give. But what? And when? The day had come, the day when everything would be decided. The sun was high, and the town seemed to be holding its breath. The lawmen, led by Wyatt Earp and his brothers, had been tracking Takashi relentlessly. They believed they were close, but they didn't know just how close they were to the end of their search. The Apache warrior whom they feared and hunted had spent the past few days preparing for the inevitable confrontation, but it was more than just a fight that awaited them. Takashi knew the curse that haunted the town would not be lifted by any gunfight. It would only end when the truth had been spoken and accepted. Josie had done what she could. She had spoken to the people, told them the truth, and asked them to listen. The room at the saloon had been filled with uncertainty, and many had doubted her words. The lawmen, particularly Wyatt, had been skeptical, unwilling to believe that everything they had worked for could be a lie. But Josie had stood firm. She had given them the truth, but the choice to act on it was no longer in her hands. Now, as Takashi moved toward the town, he could feel the weight of everything pressing on his shoulders. He had done his part. He had shown Josie the truth, and she had carried it to the people. The rest now was up to them. The curse had bound them together, but it could only be broken if they chose to let go of their fear and hatred. Takashi stood on the outskirts of the town, looking at the buildings that stretched out before him. The streets were empty, but he knew they were waiting for him. The lawmen would be expecting him soon, and soon the whole town would be forced to face the reality of their situation. There was no going back. He could feel the eyes of the people on him even from this distance, and he could sense the tension building. The moment of truth had arrived. As he stepped forward, his mind raced with the memories of all that had brought him here. He thought of the elders who had spoken of this moment, the words of warning that had echoed through his life. He had never asked for this curse. He had never asked to be the one to carry the burden of his people's mistakes. But now he knew that he had no choice. He had to face it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been caught in the web of lies. Takashi reached the edge of the town, where he was greeted by a group of lawmen. Wyatt Earp, standing at the front of the group, narrowed his eyes as he saw the Apache warrior. Takashi could see the suspicion in Wyatt's eyes, but he also saw something else. Something that hadn't been there before. There was hesitation now. Wyatt was no longer just the lawman on a mission to capture an outlaw. He was a man who had been forced to confront the truth, just like everyone else in Tombstone. "You're here," Wyatt said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "What do you want, Takashi?" "I've come to end this," he said simply. "I didn't bring the curse. The curse was brought by fear and lies, and it will only end when the truth is known. It is time for the town to understand what really happened." Wyatt exchanged a glance with his brothers, and for the first time, Takashi saw the doubt in their eyes. They were not the same men who had set out to capture him just days before. Something had changed. Perhaps it was Josie's words, or perhaps it was the growing weight of the curse that had forced them to confront their actions. Whatever it was, Takashi knew that this was a moment of decision. "Are you saying you didn't raid that ranch?" Wyatt asked, his voice cautious but curious. Takashi nodded. "It was not my people. It was a different group, but my name was used to cover their tracks. I've been blamed for something I didn't do." The lawmen listened closely, and for the first time, Takashi could see that they were beginning to understand. He had come here with nothing but his word and the truth, and now it seemed that the truth was finally reaching them. "You expect us to just believe you?" Wyatt asked, a trace of disbelief in his voice. Takashi's face softened. "I don't expect you to believe me just because I say it. But I ask you to listen, to see beyond the fear, beyond the lies. The curse that haunts this town is not something that can be fought with guns. It's a curse that can only be lifted when the truth is embraced." For a long moment there was silence. The lawmen looked at each other, the weight of the decision clear in their eyes. Wyatt looked at Takashi one last time, then nodded slowly. "We've made mistakes," he said quietly. "We've acted on fear and suspicion, but maybe it's time to make things right." Takashi felt a sense of relief wash over him. But it wasn't just the lawmen's words that gave him peace. It was the understanding that the curse could only be lifted if the people of Tombstone were ready to accept the truth. They had lived in fear for so long, and it wasn't easy to let go of that fear. But now it seemed that they were ready. The curse, once spoken in anger, would finally come to an end, not with violence, but with the acceptance of truth. As the lawmen and Takashi walked into town, the people stood in silence, watching them with wary eyes. The town that had been torn apart by fear and distrust was now on the verge of healing. The lawman stood beside the Apache warrior, no longer seeing him as an enemy, but as a man who had been wronged. The curse had been broken, not by bloodshed, but by the willingness to confront the lies and let go of the fear that had gripped them for so long. Takashi looked around the town, his heart finally at peace. The curse had been broken, and Tombstone had been given a chance to rebuild. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a beginning. A beginning where truth and understanding could guide them toward a better future.